Nullarbor Plain Cave entrance collapse. In 1988, an Australian cave explorer named Andrew White led a team of 15 divers into one of the longest underwater cave systems in the world. The caves were hidden beneath the Nullarbor Plain in southern Australia, a vast, flat, treeless landscape stretching for hundreds of miles. Beneath the surface, the limestone rock held enormous water-filled tunnels that had been carved out over millions of years. White and his team had been exploring the system for over a month, mapping passages that no human had ever seen before. On the last day of the expedition, they were hauling their equipment out of the cave when disaster struck. A freak storm hit the Nullarbor Plain without warning, dumping torrential rain onto the normally bone-dry desert. The water flooded into the cave entrance with terrifying speed. Then the middle section of the cave collapsed. Tons of rock and earth came crashing down, blocking the only way in or out of the system. 15 people were now trapped underground with no exit. White and one other team member were caught in the middle section on a small rock ledge between the collapse and the rising water. Boulders were rolling through the floodwater around them, and the ceiling above was crumbling. They had two choices: stay on the ledge and be crushed between the falling ceiling and the rising water, or try to find a way through the chaos. They chose to move, climbing desperately through the collapsing rock while water surged around their legs. By some miracle, they found a gap in the rubble and managed to reach a rope that had been lowered down from the surface by people who had seen the collapse from above. They were hauled out, battered and soaked, but alive. But the other 13 team members were still trapped much deeper in the cave, in a larger chamber beyond the collapse zone. The boulders had completely choked the passageway that connected them to the exit. For the next 2 days, a desperate operation unfolded above and below ground. Surface teams scrambled to find a new way down into the cave, exploring every crack and hole in the limestone for an alternative entrance. Meanwhile, the trapped divers worked from below, searching for any passage that might lead them around the blockage. Inch by inch, the two groups worked toward each other through the shattered rock. They met in the middle and laid a guideline through the new route. One by one, all 13 trapped team members were brought to the surface alive. Valhalla Pit Cave Rockfall Crushing. On June 10, 1984, two young students from the Georgia Institute of Technology drove to the remote hills of Jackson County, Alabama, to explore one of the most impressive caves in the American South. The cave was called Valhalla, and its entrance was a massive open pit that dropped 227 feet straight down through solid rock into an enormous underground chamber. The two students were Sam Crawford and Michael Hainebaum, and they were experienced enough to rappel down the long rope into the darkness below. Valhalla was a legendary cave among American cavers. Its entrance pit was one of the deepest freefall drops in the southeastern United States. At the bottom, the chamber opened into a cathedral-sized room with towering walls that disappeared into shadow far above. The floor was covered in a massive pile of boulders and broken rock that had fallen from the walls and ceiling over thousands of years. This kind of rock pile is called a tailless slope, and it is one of the most common features at the bottom of deep cave pits. What most cavers do not think about is that the process that built that pile is still happening. Rocks are still falling. On that summer day, Sam and Michael reached the bottom of the pit safely and began exploring the chamber. At some point, another member of their group began climbing the rope back up toward the surface. When a caver climbs a rope in a vertical pit, their movements can dislodge loose stones from the walls, sending debris raining down on anyone below. To protect themselves from falling stones, Sam and Michael moved to a sheltered spot at the base of a rock wall near the edge of the chamber. They believed they were safe under the overhang of a massive boulder that jutted out from the cave wall above them. Then, without any warning, the boulder they were sheltering beneath broke free from the wall. The rock was enormous. Witnesses later described it as being the size of a school bus. It peeled away from the cave wall in silence and dropped straight down onto the two students below. Sam Crawford and Michael Hainebaum were crushed instantly. There was no time to run, no time to scream, and no time to react in any way. The rock that was supposed to protect them became the thing that killed them. Their companions at the top of the pit heard the sickening crash echo up from the bottom of the shaft. When rescuers eventually reached the floor of the cave, they found the two young men buried beneath the massive boulder. There was nothing anyone could do. The weight of the rock was far too great to move, and both students had died on impact. Lechuguilla Cave Rockfall Burial. On March 31st, 1991, a 40-year-old expert caver named Emily Davis Mobley was 2 miles deep inside the longest and deepest cave in the United States. The cave was Lechuguilla, hidden in a remote wilderness area of Carlsbad Caverns National Park in southeastern New Mexico. Lechuguilla stretched for over 54 miles of mapped passages and plunged 1,565 feet below the desert surface. A tangled labyrinth of enormous chambers, razor-sharp formations, and terrifying vertical drops. It was closed to the public and only accessible to a handful of highly trained cave explorers approved by the National Park Service. Emily was one of those elite cavers. She had been exploring caves since 1969 and had over 2 decades of experience underground. She was part of a 5-person mapping expedition, documenting new passages in one of the most spectacular cave systems on Earth. On that March morning, about 1,000 feet below the surface, Emily was climbing a steep slope when she reached up and grabbed a large boulder to pull herself higher. The boulder, weighing between 80 and 100 pounds, broke free from the wall without warning. Emily fell 12 feet down the slope, and the massive rock followed her down and slammed directly into her left leg just below the knee. The impact shattered her tibia and left her pinned to the ground in excruciating pain, 2 miles from the cave entrance and nearly 1,000 feet underground. Her teammates rushed to her side and splinted her leg as best they could with the limited supplies they had, but getting Emily out of Lechuguilla was going to be one of the most difficult cave rescues ever attempted in America. The path to the surface involved narrow crawlways, boulder fields with gaping holes, and vertical cliff faces that would need to be scaled with ropes and pulleys. One section alone, a 40-foot wide chasm called Freakout Traverse with a 100-foot drop below, would require Emily to be suspended on a rope and pulled across while strapped to a stretcher. Another section was a 250-foot slope called the Great White Way that took rescuers an entire day just to haul her up. Word of the accident spread through the caving community, and within hours, expert cave rescuers from across the United States began converging on Carlsbad. More than 200 people would eventually be involved in the operation. Over 100 experienced cavers underground, and another 100 support workers on the surface. Many of the underground rescuers had 10 to 20 years of caving experience, and they needed every bit of it. Emily refused to be treated like a helpless victim. Even with a shattered leg, she dragged herself through the easier sections of the cave, using her arms and her one good leg. When she could not move on her own, the rescue teams carried her on a specially rigged stretcher through passages that were barely wide enough for one person. At one point, rescuers used a system of ropes and pulleys to slide Emily across the Freakout Traverse, a 100-foot drop yawning below her as she hung in the darkness. Despite the pain and the fear, Emily kept her spirits high throughout the entire ordeal. She joked with her rescuers, gave them advice on technique, and at one point even asked them to deliver pizza underground. The rescue took 4 full days, 91 hours from the moment the rock hit her leg to the moment she emerged from the cave entrance. When her stretcher finally poked up through the opening of Lechuguilla just after 1 o'clock in the morning, Emily looked up at the sky and sang out, "Sand Cave Trapped Explorer Tragedy." On January 30th, 1925, a cave explorer named Floyd Collins crawled into a narrow cave called Sand Cave in rural Kentucky. Floyd was 37 years old and had been exploring caves since he was 6, searching for underground wonders he could open to paying tourists. In those days, landowners around the Mammoth Cave area competed fiercely with each other to attract visitors, a period known as the Kentucky Cave Wars. Floyd had already discovered Great Crystal Cave on his family's farm, but it was too far from the main road to draw enough customers. So he made a deal with a neighbor to explore Sand Cave, which sat right beside the busy Cave City Road. Floyd entered alone, carrying nothing but a single kerosene lantern, and began squeezing through passages so tight he had to crawl on his stomach with one arm stretched out ahead. He pushed deeper and deeper, excited by what the cave might hold. But as he turned to make his way back out, his foot knocked loose a 27-pound rock that fell and pinned his ankle inside the narrow crawlway. He was trapped just 55 feet below the surface, wedged in a space barely wider than his own body. Floyd screamed for help, but it was hours before anyone realized he had not come home. The next day, neighbors found his coat hanging outside the cave entrance and sent a 17-year-old boy crawling back through the tunnel to find him. The boy reached Floyd and confirmed the terrible news. He was alive but completely stuck. Word spread fast, and within days, what started as a local rescue became a national sensation. Reporters from across America descended on the tiny Kentucky community, and radio stations broadcast updates to millions of listeners. A young newspaper reporter named William Burke Miller was small enough to crawl into the passage and actually interview Floyd underground. Miller brought him food and water and later won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the rescue. For 4 days, rescuers were able to reach Floyd and keep him alive with supplies passed through the narrow tunnel. But on the 5th day, a section of the passage collapsed, sealing off the only route to reach him. From that moment on, no one could get to Floyd. They could only hear his voice echoing faintly through the rocks. Engineers and miners were brought in to dig a rescue shaft straight down from the surface. Above ground, the scene turned into a circus. An estimated 10,000 people gathered at the site on a single Sunday, and vendors sold food and drinks to the crowds. The day became known as Carnival Sunday, and it remains one of the strangest spectacles in American history. Below the surface, Floyd Collins lay alone in the freezing, cold darkness, slowly dying of thirst, hunger, and hypothermia. Day after day, the rescue shaft inched closer, but Floyd's voice grew weaker until it finally went silent. On February 16, 1925, after 17 days of digging, rescuers finally broke through to Floyd's position. They found him dead, his body still pinned by the rock that had trapped him, his ankle still locked in the same position. He had likely died around the 13th of February, 3 full days before they reached him.